Hi, welcome to the next episode of Triggers and Spiritual Medicine. My name is Laura Bonetzky-Joseph, and this is where we have real talk. We address the big elephants in the room to the growing sickness of our society, address root issues, and provide sustainable solutions. We hope by addressing various intersectionalities and connect the dots to many of society's challenges, we can help others understand kind of like this infection, this trauma infection that affects all of the areas of our life, whether it's communication, addiction, domestic violence, racism, homelessness, sexual abuse, chronic health issues, environmental issues, climate change, all of this stuff. A lot of times there's like an underbelly, and that's kind of what we're addressing here. This is a collaborative program, so we hope that you support our endeavors. Please subscribe to our Patreon for more, and make sure you like, share, subscribe, all those good things. With each episode, we address a certain trigger while offering the spiritual medicine of at least 3 tips or actionable steps that you, our listeners, are here to, that you can take with you and implement. Today, I am super excited. Please help me introduce Precious, and please help me say how you say your last name.
Sure, Stepney.
Stepney. Okay, I didn't want to like say it incorrectly. Okay, Precious Stepney. Now, talk about blending something where we have Precious, who basically ran a mental health psychiatric hospital. And now she's bridging in these amazing things. And to me, this is the medicine, right? It is how we're shifting, how we're looking at all these amazing things. So Precious is an active mother of 2. She's an enthusiastic member of the Anu Life Global Ministries, a facilitator of the Alpha Woman Now experience on YouTube, a True Health Live podcast co-host, the author of The Spiritual Guide to Overcoming 7 Mental Ailments, and she has spent the last 20 years of her professional career as a mental health administrator, and recently stepped away as the chief executive officer of a large state operating psychiatric hospital. So please welcome Precious, please. And I believe you blend some yoga stuff too, correct?
There's so much.
So much. Okay. So please, tell me, first of all, what got you into to become like a mental health facilitator? And I believe it was in New York, correct?
Absolutely, it was. So first, thank you, Laura, for having me. Yes, so my career, I'm a native New Yorker, although thankfully I saw it fit to relocate recently. My career just began in the juvenile justice system, just working with at-risk youth, and the opportunity presented itself for me to really do some statistical analysis and quality management in a psychiatric hospital. I had no idea that I'd wind up spending upwards of 20 plus years in that particular field, where I just kind of moved through the ranks and eventually became a CEO of a hospital in one of the boroughs, right to and through the beginning of COVID. And that was the biggest and loudest alarm that it was time for me to be more authentic about what I wanted out of life and how I would get there, and how I could also give of myself more abundantly.
What led you to get into that field? Like what was it that inspired you to go and start your career in that direction?
Sure. I wanted to be an advocate. I thought that it was really important. Like I said, I started with juvenile justice, and I moved through even corrections. And I saw myself as someone who, as a melanin dominant female, I saw myself as someone who the clients could relate to and identify with, but also I could serve as a model. And while, you're starting with counseling and casework, you don't necessarily recognize how much of a model you'll wind up being. But that began my journey. And as it moved more fully into behavioral health, the priority was really just ensuring that the clients received quality care. And while I am not a clinician, my focus was always on public administration and making sure that the organization functions optimally. And that kind of worked out as far as being able to meld priorities with practice for the clinicians.
What did you see when you worked with the at-risk youth? What did you see that actually, first of all, so I feel like we're going to hit like both ends, like what worked really well, but also what did you find to be most challenging that you felt like you really struggled with in helping them?
Sure. So I'd say one of the greatest challenges was empowering leadership to see the whole person. So we've got to like back up. This is 20 plus years ago. And so that idea of treating the whole individual is while it may sound like it's been around for a long time, in reality, the practice was not always there. And so services were very silo, and you kind of had to go over here and follow this one process to get a family member of an individual, of a youth, the appropriate support services. So for most children, for most teens, the challenge is really the familial supports. And the appropriate supports not necessarily being available, accessible, or I would say available or accessible. And sometimes it was just a matter of being that hand that actually says, okay, I know how to navigate this particular system, so let's work together. So while yes, in that role, it was my expectation was to ensure that this young person is no longer at risk for being taken into a juvenile detention facility again, or it was a re-entry prevention program.
What did you notice? Like, what did you notice was happening? Like, because I mean, we talk about, like, I know, like with the work I do in trauma, right? There seems to be patterns. What did you notice that was landing these kids? Like, what were the root issues that were causing these kids to end up being in these positions to begin with?
Sure.
Did you see a pattern,
Yeah, I'd actually say that in most instances, they didn't have anyone to share with authentically, to communicate with authentically. There weren't substantial resources to support their well-being. And I wouldn't say it was because of a lack of a loving or nurturing family environment. I think it had more to do with the socioeconomic challenges that the family faced, right? So if mom and dad are both working and they're striving towards meeting this goal of getting the bills paid and having food on the table, then establishing even a physical presence in the home is often challenging if you're working two shifts, to meet ends meet. I think oftentimes it was really just being able to let the youth identify appropriate outlets and actually share what's happening with them. That was the remedy in many instances, or that's what was lacking in many instances, I would say.
What did you feel like you felt was working when you were able to make impact? Like, what was some of the impact you noticed that was actually working to kind of prevent like going down that wrong path, right?
Right. Yeah, oftentimes the being able to find successful school placement. So sometimes the challenge had to do with a history of trauma at a particular school, or a history of conflict with a particular individual, whether it be student, but oftentimes it was the dynamic with other adults in a school or in a community, even sometimes in a program, like a service provider may have just been really cruel. But because this child is
I think some of us can identify, by the way, just got to say, since COVID, with service providers, I have never seen so much medical trauma in the past 2 or 3 years inflicted on people than I've witnessed. I just got to say that for those who might be feeling it.
No, absolutely. And so oftentimes what I would notice is that the remedy was really just being that presence and making it clear that I'm an advocate for you. I'm going to make sure that your needs are met. And so, you know, today there are services called bridger services, and those are the individuals that will bridge that gap between where you are and what you need, where that next service provider may be. I would say 20 something years ago, that was what I did. I was that bridger service to ensure that you actually make a safe and healthy connection.
Yeah, I mean, I remember when I used to teach college, and we had this, I remember as a teacher, you know, there was this one troubled student, and I think we all see this, right? And they're one of those, and you go, oh my gosh, like, because they're a disruptor in the classroom, right? Because there's something, right? And I remember, you know, this is college, and they'd be like, well, Miss Joseph, you just don't understand. And then they would go on to like one tangent, X, Y, and Z, this happens. And they go, well, we have something for that, and it's called X, Y, and Z, right? And then it would be another thing. So it was like always an excuse or this or that, and I kept giving the solution. And one day they approached me in the middle of the library, and they said, Miss Joseph, I got to talk to you, as I was preparing for a midterm that day. And I said, what's the challenge? And they said, I just became homeless.
Oh boy.
And I just looked at them, my healer hat went on, right? And I go, why do I feel like you have been through a lot worse than this? And they kind of laughed, right? And they go, yeah. And I go, okay, I want to do you a favor. And I gave them a name of a homeless shelter, because this is also where the college failed. They didn't have somebody who had those resources, that when a student was challenged like that, they couldn't give them a place where they could go, where they could be safe, right? And so, and I said, I'm going to do you a favor. Do what you got to do to study and pass for this test. I'm going to let you out early so you can go take care of whatever you need to do. I'm not going to dock you for the time, but if you tell a single soul, any of the other students, that'll be the last favor I'll ever give you, right? Next semester, one of the students was giving us crap about, well, you're the only teacher that's not giving me an A, right? She stands up, starts twirling her head and going like, you have no idea how much this teacher cares about you, and all the, and I'm sitting there going like, wow, like you don't know sometimes how much of an impact when you have, because here's these cries for help, and it sometimes takes one simple ear, one simple action, and somebody to give a crap to help them get there. That's it.
Absolutely.
I didn't feel like I did above and beyond. It was simple. And I think there's so many that fall through the cracks because they just don't know where to go. And yeah, I just had to say that. So
no, absolutely. And you know, the key, as I'm listening, the key was that you were sensitive enough to recognize that healer hat is always there, right? And so when this particular student communicated a challenge, I imagine you were able to connect the dots, even in that second, to all of the challenges that he or she presented leading up to this major one.
And I was super proud of them when they graduated. Right. Like, I was like, yes, like, you know, and, you know, the pay was horrible, but to this day, I really miss doing that, because I enjoy impacting lives like that when you see the simplicity. And I think, you know, when we have at-risk youth, it doesn't take a lot. It really doesn't.
Right.
And I just struggle, like when I see some things and I go, how do we shift this, you know? And so I applaud you what you were able to do, you know, and helping them connect the dots, like you said, 20 years ago. You know, but my father was also an osteopath. So I remember when he was ostracized in Massachusetts, called a quack in the 1970s and 1980s. Right. And like other doctors would literally throw eggs at his office because, you know, it was just the way it was. And like, these are things you don't hear about healthcare, right? And certain professions within them. And now, we have plenty of osteopaths in Massachusetts, but I didn't even know until about like 10 years ago, he was actually there meeting with the governor representing osteopathic physicians to get them recognized as a legitimate medical profession.
Wow.
And I'm like, my introverted dad did that? Like,
We never know. We never
you
quite
never
know.
know. So it happens, right? Like, there's just different systems, right? So how did that like transition? If you went from doing case management, right, with like with at-risk youth, so how did you go from that to like working and running a mental hospital, like a psychiatric hospital?
Yes. So
that's a big leap.
Yeah, and it's a 20-year leap as well, right? So that's where I started. I transitioned into working in corrections for a little while, just a few years. And while finishing my master's, actually, I think I acquired my master's. It was just an opportunity, right? I said, okay, I'll take this opportunity. It took me out of at that in corrections, it was more supervision work, but it was still working one-on-one with inmates. And this particular opportunity, which was doing quality management and survey readiness, seemed interesting. I actually thought the idea of working in a psychiatric, it was a forensic, my first job was a forensic psychiatric hospital. So that's even more special for those who don't know, even though I think forensic psychology is such a popular field.
I learned a lot from Dr. Jess Taylor, who was my guest in my June, and learning what, I mean, she was on the Amber Heard team. So and learning a lot, like, like that's a whole thing, and what I hear that goes into that, especially working with like police departments and everything else, and I mean, her specialty was sexual assault, at the time, but yeah, that's a whole game changer right there.
Right. And in a forensic psychiatric hospital, especially one at the state level, what you'll find is that any individual that may appear on the news as having committed a crime that seems really, really outlandish, or really, really violent, is often sent to a forensic psychiatric hospital, because it has the component, it's a locked facility essentially, and you have to be mandated there by the courts, usually by the criminal court system. And I began my journey there, just really focusing on what some might call the boring end of patient care, which is the actual black and white Medicaid regulations. Why do we run a hospital this way? And how does it ensure patient care? And that was my role for many years. I'd say any quality staff knows you have to know how the hospital runs from soup to nuts. And so that's how it led me to being a CEO.
So when you look back, like your 20-year journey, or even as like a kid, if you can picture yourself, geez, like, would you have seen where you are today? Like, that 6-year-old little girl, saying, this is what I want to be when I grow up.
No. I actually would have seen her where I was 5 years ago, working tirelessly, overexerting herself, living up to the Western standard for what life is supposed to look like. I think that I was fully wedded to that false image. And I'm going to say it's a very false image, because it actually, unless you find that that's truly where your happiness is, in doing that sort of thing. And I'm not referring specifically to the job, but to the mindset that I had, that I had to make this amount of money, and I had to live in this neighborhood, and my life needed to look like this fairy tale image, right? That part, that's that I'm referring to.
It's funny because I learned a lot from a colleague of mine who was another previous guest. Her whole thing is dismantling that whole capitalist business model, because it's like, you don't have to. Why do we subscribe to that? Like,
Exactly.
and it really comes down to, I say it's that old white Anglo-Saxon British tea company mentality, right? Because it's, when you really think about it, that system never really changed. It just grew into different
Right.
structures. And because I think I've struggled with that whole mentality myself. It's like, the pressure, I feel like I got to be Martha Stewart, because if I'm not, then I'm not worthy of anything, right? So it's like, why do especially women, have to like push yourselves to the point of like burnout and breaking to feel
Absolutely.
like you're going to be successful, and not recognizing the value of resting and knowing when to regroup and knowing how to replenish your nervous system so you can be out there and doing what you are meant to do, right? I mean, it's like really, and I think what COVID has taught us is really how we need to unpack that. I think a lot of people, I think that's probably why we had the greatest resignation
Yeah.
that we've ever seen, because people are really recognizing, it's like, we don't have to be a slave to corporate America,
Correct. Yeah.
working 60, 90 hours a day, a week, and have no life,
Right.
you
Yeah.
know?
As I'm listening to you, I'm thinking about it, and I said, COVID in many ways was a great disruptor. That experience gave us the opportunity to stop and truly think. I mean, for many, I wasn't a part of that many, but for many, you locked in at home. But for the few that actually had to continue to serve their community, the world still slowed down enough for you to actually think about, at least for myself, the choices I was making and where I actually wanted to be. And I would have to say that's where community becomes really important. However you may define that. And for me, that definition came through being a member of Honor Life Global Ministries. That experience of having a foundational standard that we're all living by, it helped to foster, no, this is the line. The line is here, and I'm going to make some changes. I became a CEO at a young age, much younger than my colleagues. Usually that's what you do right before you retire, right?
Right.
You run a hospital for a few years, apparently. So I knew coming into it, I was only in my early 40s. I says, clearly I'm not going to be here, right? I'm not going to be here until I'm 60 or 55 or retirement age. So this is just one piece of my life's mission. And before I was 44, I knew I had to leave that environment. And so I did. I just left.
So what was the trigger that said, kind of like, this is enough? And, because I
Right.
think a lot of people, when they do that, either they're just very ambitious or whatever, and they just have a nerve, and they just, it's kind of like adrenaline. They kind of flow the adrenaline. Others, like I see, are like, yeah, but I need a roof over my head. I just can't quit my job, right? So like, what was that trigger or that defining moment that said no? Like, what was that one thing that triggered you to say, this needs to change?
It was my mental health, my personal wellness, right? And I can say mental health today. I don't think that when I made the decision, I said, I've got to prioritize my mental health. I think in that moment, I was just so tired. I was just so angry and so frustrated with knowing that I was competent enough and skilled enough to pull a leadership together and to run a hospital, but that the limitation became my superiors. And so there was this challenge of even worth and value. I don't look like what the average healthcare executive would be perceived as looking like. And so that presented its own sort of minute by minute challenges. I remember going to each hospital has a relationship with a particular medical school, right? And so I went to the graduation for some of the residents. And at the graduation, of course, we're seated at the table with other hospital CEOs, and I'm being introduced by my medical director. And someone says, "Oh, you're a CEO? You look a bit more artsy, like you'll be in the arts field." And it's like, right, you're laughing, and it's like, okay, is this okay? Right, I understand.
I remember you sharing. I remember sharing something about what happened to you was somebody came in your office and you had like all these little kind of spiritual things in your office. Can you share that story? Because that was phenomenal.
I can. Oh, sure. So I mean, as you can see with all of the accoutrement behind me, I like decorating a space and being very intentional about
and the energy in the space. Right?
Yeah, well, I
like
was going to say also very intuitive, right? And so it's not just decorating, but really creating a space that is healing and that satisfies all of the senses. And so you could smell my office all the way down the hall, because while you can't burn anything, I always had a diffuser going. But I had this huge selenite bar. It was about, yeah, it was pretty substantial.
I have one of those in my office.
Yes, yes.
3 of them.
Yeah, I have 2. So, so as I had to prepare my new office, this was a selenite wand that I had in my home. And something intuitively just said, bring this to work. And as I washed down my office and kind of placed everything where I wanted it, I decided to put that bar right at the front of my desk, so that anyone sitting on the other side was facing that selenite wand. And there was a particular staff person who was really challenging from the very beginning. And he'd come into my office one day and sat across from the bar and pointed. It was almost as if he knew not to touch it. He knew, but he pointed and says, "I think this means something." He goes, "What is this?" And I says, "Oh, it's a crystal." And he goes, I think I want to meet at another space." And I said, "Absolutely, we can meet wherever you like." And so we went into a conference room. But I kind of thought, okay, well, it's doing its job, right?
Yeah. It's so fascinating. Like, when my office was inside of a medical office, right? Originally, the physician, the way I decorated my office was like, he thought the pink color was puke, right? Or diarrhea, like that's what he called it, like, but it was kind of like a muted kind of green, and because I brought in the earth, and I even brought in like a jute rug, and I had my lamp, my one and only lamp I had in there was a waterfall lamp. And so I was bringing the elements out in and in. And what started happening was before the patients would go to the exam room, they would go by my office and they'd be like, "Well, why can't we meet there?" Like, And before you know it, he was asking if he could do his patient charts at my desk, because
it felt better, right?
It felt better, right? Exactly. So I get a kick. Like, I just say, I remember one day I was telling a friend of mine who's a nurse practitioner, I was saying, yeah, I used to even come in and we would sage. I said, but I would go to the one area where he would write charts, because I would go by there and I'd be like, oh, and I would just go next pile. And I would just sit there and wait and see, like, okay, what's his mood today? He's going to write all these charts. And I kind of did all these experiments. And before you knew it, was like everything, like the energy in the office completely changed. And even the patients started commenting, right. But it was all with little subtle things. It wasn't really big things, right? Because it's like when you change the energy, I had one person who is in the spiritual community go, "Laura, why do you cleanse the space so often?" I go, "Do you know who comes in here? Is people that are sick." So, which means, like, they're not coming in here because they're happy and they're jovial and they just want to pop in and say hi. They're coming in here because they need help. So that's
Right.
heavy, dense energy before they even walk through the door, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so, when you bring in these other things, it brings in like that natural healing thing that science, yes, is starting to finally catch up. Like
Yeah.
they're
Yeah.
starting to finally get it. So what made you think, like, so you had this experience with this person, right?
Mhm.
Um, and what did you start noticing with people when you had your office decorated in this way?
Right. Yeah. Similar to what you described, there were lots of visitors, and that's the best way to put it. Staff were just they were more interested in coming into that space. Well-wishing staff, and I would say the ones who may not have had the best of intentions, they might not have felt as 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 comfortable in that space, which is also it's okay, because energetically it's important that we are establishing boundaries, right, for ourselves and for what should happen in a particular vessel, which is a space. I would also say that the space was definitely a wellness environment. And so, New York is unionized. And so when I got to the organization, there's labor and there's management and there's this history of conflict. And my meeting with an informal dialogue with one of the first union presidents was arms folded, and he's coming with the contingent of delegates and vice presidents, and everyone's got a notepad. And I just said, listen, I welcome you. And before we even have any formal dialogue, what I want to do is I'm going to tell you all of the facilities that I've worked in. I want you to reach out to the union president for each of those facilities and just find out the type of leader I've been before we enter into any dialogue. What wound up happening after that's all done is my office and the space around my office became the meeting hub, the check-in, the hey, Mrs. Stepney, how are you? And I'm on conference calls or in meetings, or my secretary will knock on my door like, Mr. So-and-so is here to just say hello or to bring you a snack. And it became this place of love, and wellness, not just for the staff, and not just for the patients, but for everyone. And I think that's what we're supposed to be. We're supposed to be that loving kindness for one another.
I think I remember you sharing a story too regarding the union where you noticed something. If you mind sharing that story with the
Sure.
underprivileged and those, especially those that worked in lower skilled, and what you were able to do.
Yeah. So, that was actually a legitimate concern that one of the unions had, that their staff in a particular department, they could not get a full-time position. So they were only 0.5, which is a half of an FTE. So you're only working half-time, technically, though we'd schedule you out on a full-time schedule. And I was told that this was the rationale, one, for financial reasons, but also for flexibility, so that wherever we had a hole in the staffing schedule, Laura could just be called in at any given moment. Mm-hmm. And when this complaint came to me, but from the unions, I thought, how would I have quality of life? How would I have a great quality of life if I never knew if I could pick my children up from school or not, because if the job calls, I need to come in, or my schedule from one week to the next fluctuates and changes. And so ultimately what we wound up doing is polling the staff, finding out how many of the part-timers actually had a desire to be full-time, because that was the other thing. Oh, the staff love it like this. Do they really? They love it.
Have you talked to them, right?
Like, and this is like housekeeping and food services, and I'm like, I don't think we took a voice of the customer survey to determine that they prefer this. And what we were able to do is to ensure that the staff who really wanted to be full-time got the opportunity first. And it worked out really, really well. So yeah.
What did you notice that changed when that happened? What did you notice?
Listen, so on a personal level, it fostered a connection between myself and all levels of staff. Quite honestly, my identification is with everyone in the hospital, because I look at them and I can see a relative, a friend, a neighbor. No matter what position, no matter what title you may have been given, I could see something in you that's very familiar. And so what that created is this buzz. So the people who didn't know who I was in the hospital would hear from their colleagues.
They wanted to know who you were.
That's right. That's so-and-so. Right. And so then it became this, like, you walk through the halls and it took an hour to get from one wing to another, because, you know, there are these beautiful exchanges that happen. And to me, those are the things that make you show up to work on the days when you really just don't feel like it, knowing that you're in a warm environment, you know?
So because I know you wrote a book. So what did you learn? You know, because this whole thing obviously taught you things. Like I always say, sometimes your clients, or when you go through these things, these negotiations, all these type of things, they teach you, just like that student, even though I made the impact, witnessing the impact also taught me something, right? So what transpired to make you want to write this book? Would you like to share about that?
Sure. That came directly as instruction, right? So within my community, I have something called a covering, someone, a man who functions like a big brother, who essentially ensures that I'm okay, you know, that if I'm stressed or worried or needing to get any level of assistance or guidance, that it's there. And when I decided to, and was supported in relocating to the South, the question was, well, what are you going to do now? What is your level up going to look like for the upcoming year? And I had no idea. I'm like, level up? I don't know. What level am I on? What levels do I want?
You were CEO of a psychiatric hospital.
Right. It's like, what else is there? I want to do nothing. But I had always enjoyed, for many, many years, enjoyed studying scripture. And the idea was presented, well, the instructions were given, you're going to write a book, and you're going to bring mental health and scripture together. And I thought, oh, great, I get to go to seminary school. This is going to be so awesome. And it's like, no, you have what you need already. And that was the initial kind of, let's put this little seed in the ground. And I just sat with it. And I said, okay, I'm not a clinician. And while I'm not a clinician, I did this work for 20 years. And what I recognize is that we may not all walk around with a clinical diagnosis. It doesn't mean that we don't experience a very similar phenomena as just human beings. We all experience worry and fear and angst and self-doubt, and we go through these cycles of feeling alone. And yes, while anxiety is, you know, you can be clinically diagnosed, all of the other ones, no. But it doesn't mean that they aren't equally as debilitating as the one experiencing it. So I began to kind of take note of some of the common ails that we all have as a society, and began to align it with scripture. And then as I looked at that, I said, well, let me add some more. I know that as I stretch my body, I stretch my mind. As I'm able to move through a particular set of asana, I would cry. Why am I crying when I'm doing this particular stretch? Why am I unable to get my heels to the floor when I'm doing a squat? What is this pain, and why is it moving through my hips? And realizing that, just like with massage and just like with Reiki and yoga, when we experience these technologies, they're actually tools to help us release what we're storing in our body. so that what's actually been placed in our body can function in a more, and it can function, period.
Yeah, I mean, I am so relieved to like that there's science starting to come out with this, because for 20 years, I was helping people, or well, it's in the body, it's this, and it's here, and this is where it's stored in the tissues. And now science is starting to come in and saying, yeah, now they're just calling it somatic therapies, and I'm like, oh, well, ask any of the indigenous and sacred and ancient teachings. They've been doing it for thousands of years, We just are just now understanding that, like with my Japanese teachers, we always said, well, the mind, the head is one body, right? It's like to get the mental and emotional body. Yeah, we understand mind, body, spirit, but not as really recognizing that they actually have their own kind of inner wisdom. They're interdependent and independent of each other. And so like when we experience, like fear, anger, or whatever, how is it showing up in the mental, emotional body? How is it showing up in the physical body? How is it showing up in the spiritual body, right? And, and I think that's why, like when we go to psychotherapy, we wonder why we're not getting better, because we're addressing only one body, right? We're not addressing the other pieces. Or I go to the doctor, well, why am I not getting better? So it's like, why is this wound not healing? Because maybe there's another component that isn't addressed in a different area of the body, right? So, but I got a question for you, because you said scriptures. So for those who might not, because that comes across as very kind of Christian dominated, I guess. So especially in the light of what we see in this culture, how would you, one, address it to those that actually do align with scripture? And how would you address it for those that actually might kind of repulse isn't the right word. It's like they're deterred because maybe they had a bad experience with the church, or maybe they just align with a different religion,
right,
or spiritual practice.
Sure. So I'd say, one, I didn't necessarily identify, and I don't identify as a Christian or as walking with any particular religion. That being said, scripture, I find that scripture goes way beyond pinning you to a particular religion. I'm also acknowledging that yoga is a deeply profound healing modality that's used in the text, as well as activities in nature. The thing about scripture is that if for nothing else, it's examining a story that's as old as time. And what I found in examining that story is that there are so many other more ancient stories that are precisely the same.
Yes.
Different characters, maybe sometimes the names are even oddly similar, having the exact same spiritual journey and experience. And if we're identifying that we each, which I'm identifying that I am here in this physical vessel, right? I'm having this human experience, but there's this soul, there's that energy that really never dissipates. It never goes away. So therefore, I can find the medicine in a text that may be pigeonholed to I don't want to say toxic, but it may be connected to things in history that are atrocities against nations. It doesn't necessarily mean that there isn't medicine there. There are medicinal plants that when used the wrong way, it can be toxic and kill you. But when used the appropriate way, with teaching, with someone saying, hey, this is how you go to an herbalist, this is how you use this particular herb, this is how you navigate this particular experience, this is how you open this book and understand what this book is, right? First, you have to do that. This is how you actually explore these words. What does the word actually mean in Hebrew, right? What does this word actually mean? And then you realize, oh, it didn't even mean he walked with her. It meant he ushered her through, right? So it has such a different vibration that I actually challenge those who may say, I don't want anything to do with that. to not assume that it's connected to anything religious, but rather perceive the scriptures that are pulled as tools to help you get from this point to another in your wellness journey.
So what made you want to pull from scripture? Like, what was that catalyst? Like, especially this, I understand like yoga is very almost a part of your life too. So, and
Yes.
so like, why not yoga?
Mhm.
Why scripture?
Sure. So there is yoga in the book as well. So
Okay.
really, it was pulling together many of the tools that I have found healing over my little short lifespan. And so, yes, scripture is what guides the conversation. And really, it was because that's what I was instructed to do. I was told to do it this way. So in so doing, I looked at scriptures and began to recognize, well, you know what? There's a story of this guy, this boy, this little boy who, you know, is like a shepherd, and yet he's summoned to go slay this giant, right?
Mm-hmm.
So was he scared? Was he not scared? Did he experience fear? Did he not experience fear? What was his story? And how can that story help me when I'm feeling fearful because I think I'm too small or not enough or inadequately equipped? So how does someone who isn't a Christian, who isn't a clinician, write a book about scripture and mental ailments? Well, it happens because nothing ever said that I had to be either of those things to honor those processes and experiences and offer medicine, period. So that's an empowering thing. And then to actually publish, right? Like,
right?
It was so scary. It was.
So going through this whole experience, right? I mean, what comes to mind is like, what is like the things that you feel that people like, what's their triggers that you're seeing that kind of compels that this is the medicine that people need? What's like the big trigger that you see that especially has been cycling through the last couple years?
Right. I would say fear, right? So COVID put many in this state of constant fear. Fear for one, first it was fear for my life. If I catch this, if I catch this virus, if I contract this virus, what will happen to me? Then it was fear about getting the vaccine or not. Then there was fear about maintaining my employment if I decide that I don't want to participate in what's being offered. At every level, it's like the fear was compounded. And we hold so much fear in our bodies that we often lose a sense of connection with anything, because then with fear, there's doubt. So then you're walking through these cycles of, I'm really afraid to take the next step. I'm really afraid that there's even a ground for me to take that next step onto. So then I'm not sure what to do next. So I'll just stay here. I'll just do as I'm being told to do, right? I'll just continue with the path that's pretty much cleared for me to take, even though that may not be what you actually want to do.
Right, right. What would be, somebody that might be struggling, maybe afraid, maybe they're afraid to quit their job, maybe they're afraid to leave an abusive spouse, maybe they're afraid to move. I mean, there's a lot of things, a lot of systems of oppression that have been really kind of amplified, especially in the last 2 years, it seems like. I mean, it's been growing, but it just seems to be like pop, 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 and whether it's even reproductive freedom, there's a lot of fear around that, what would probably be the 3 things that you think that folks could do today to help create, either relieve fear or create more balance, whatever that might be? What are 3 things that folks could use today?
Sure.
They can
The
implement?
first I'd say is be resourced, right? And when I say resource, I'm not referring to monetary, right? I'm not referring to money necessarily. I know, identify the tools that you have that are accessible to you. Those tools can be things simply like taking a moment to breathe, and it doesn't have to be this elaborate, putting on this music to meditate, but just being able to identify the resources that are always available to you. I'm always able to close my eyes and to kind of ground myself or connect with whatever I'm identifying as greater than myself. Know that, affirm that those resources are always at your disposal, because I found that in those moments when I'm perceiving myself as being alone, those resources seem so far from me, right? We're really never alone. There is always something living around us and giving opportunities to connect. I mean, I'm looking at this plant right here that's like literally growing and wanting to kind of like come in over and touch me. So I would say that that's one. Another is identify your community. If you don't have a community, find a group of people that live a culture that you align yourself with, or that you'd like to align yourself with. Having a community, and virtual spaces are fantastic, but it's really, really important that you have that human connection. I mean, we've all watched well, maybe we all haven't, but there are often, 20, 30 years ago, there were these studies on, let's take baby A and remove baby A from mother right at birth, and let's see what happens. And let's not give eye contact to baby B, and let's put baby C directly on mother's chest. And you watch to see the impact of human contact, and human contact is paramount. So while we have
developmental trauma while you're going at it by removing it, now they understand it's developmental trauma by removing the baby.
Oh, absolutely. Right, absolutely. And being able to have that community and have those connections is, I would say, that's number two. And number three, I would say, is just move your body. Even if you just need to get up and stretch, get up and take a walk or run, stay rooted in that. Stay rooted in identifying what resources are available to you. Have a community and do not remain stagnant, right? Even if you have to push yourself to just walk up and down the steps or get out of the house, which is also a nice way to connect with others. But those would be my three.
Those communities can be like, there's been I know we do it at our office, but doesn't necessarily have to be with me, it's with others, like the growing thing with women's circles, for instance, because those are really paramount about building community. It's a place to be seen, it's a place to be heard, it's a place to be not judged, right? So finding, with the resurgence of women's circles would be a great place too, because that's a way to feel resourced as well,
Mm-hmm.
because I think a lot of us not only just want community, but they feel like they need to be heard, they need to be seen, they need to be witnessed. So it's finding communities that can hold that container in a safe way.
Yes, yeah,
that's important as well.
Yeah, I would agree. Yeah, having balance in all things is important. Yeah.
So what else would you like, as we start to wrap up here, what else would you think that folks need to know about your book or about things that you offer?
Sure. So I would just say, if you're interested in getting the book, you can go to Amazon. It's available there. The book really takes you through each of the mental ailments that we discussed, and it gives you lots of journaling activities and opportunities to go out in nature and just explore how you can remember. And the remember is broken down because you're gathering the parts of yourself that have been fractured, right? And you're bringing oneness to you. And you're doing that through many different modalities. There's lots of breathing exercises, as well as just encouraging you to create your own statements of affirmation, to acknowledge what it is that you do already have. And I just share that there's this one really fun activity, and I did not create it, but I do quote it in the book, of writing your fears a Dear John letter. We can divorce, we can separate from these things. Our fear lies to us, right? If I'm fearful about coming on and doing this podcast, and I'm like, well, Precious, what if she asks you a question you don't know? What if she pulls on something? There are all of these what ifs, right?
Yeah.
That would say, don't do it. But then if I go back and I write myself that particular fear, a letter, and I say, you lied. You said that I would make a fool of myself and that I'd be embarrassed and that there was no point in doing this because this, and this could happen. None of those things happened. In fact, these phenomenal things occurred. So even if you don't get the book, those are some tools that you can walk away with as well. Yeah, this has been fantastic. Thank you.
Good. I'm so glad that you're here. What's the best way folks can reach you?
Absolutely. So on YouTube, there is an Alpha Woman Now with Yakira-Eden channel. And there I do yin yoga, yoga nidra. I talk a little bit about the book on there, but essentially that is the wellness zone, if you will. You can also follow that same name, Alpha Woman Now, on Instagram, and on there you'll see my link tree as well, so it connects you to everything else that I do.
That's beautiful. Well, thank you so much. Thank you all for chiming in. Don't forget, please like, please share, please spread the word, comment, let us know how you liked today's episode. Again, support our mission by becoming a Patreon member. And until next time, thank you for joining Triggers in Spiritual Medicine.
Okay.